Welcome to Stop Calling Me Mental. I'm Marty O'Connor. I was born on the Curragh Camp, County Kildare. I'm a mental health advocate, writer and survivor of childhood trauma, son of a JADOTVILLE hero. My dad served 3 tours in the Congo and 5 tours in Cyprus as a UN peacekeeper with 21 years of service.
Thank you, Marty. I'm Michael Lyons, born in County Tipperary. I served in the Irish Army from 1960 to 1966 and was deployed to Cyprus in 1965 with the UN 42nd Irish Battalion. Qualifying as a motor engineer, I left the Army and emigrated to Sydney, Australia in 1970. As welfare officer from our Return Services League sub-branch, I support and advocate for our members and veterans, especially in the field of welfare.
Well, that's excellent, Michael. Now, can you tell us who our guests are today?
And I'm delighted to introduce our 2 special guests, Leo Quinlan and his son, Ronnie. Leo Quinlan is a retired Irish Army officer and is the son of Colonel Patrick Quinlan, who as a commandant commanded the Irish troops in the Battle of JADOTVILLE in the Congo in 1961. During his Army career, Leo Quinlan served as an infantry officer in Ireland, Israel, Egypt, Cyprus and Lebanon. He commanded a Ranger company and designed, trained and led the first Special Assault Group in the Irish Army. Coincidentally, Leo Quinlan commanded some of the veterans of the Battle of JADOTVILLE, and at one time his father was in fact his commanding officer. After leaving the Army, Leo has worked as a training manager in a US multinational in Ireland and the US, as well as a senior consultant in the field of human resource development, primarily for the European Commission. This work was carried out extensively in Western Europe, Russia, Pakistan, Azerbaijan, Africa, and in all Central and Eastern European countries, a total of 48 countries altogether. Most recently, his work has included working with projects with the Kenya Army, the South African Police, and also in Finland, Bosnia and Herzegovina, Macedonia, Montenegro, and Albania in a number of projects, all of which were focused on human resource development, capacity building, organization, and delivery of training. Since 2016, Leo has delivered talks on the Battle of JADOTVILLE to officers and troops from 70 different armies, veterans associations, educational organizations, historical societies, the British Legion, the International Police Association, and the corporate sector. He is currently interacting with the US War College on the subject of JADOTVILLE. Currently, Leo divides his time writing, landscape painting, and public speaking. And now I'd like to tell you about his son, Ronnie Quinlan. Ronnie has been a film television editor for more than 15 years. His television work includes I'm a Celebrity, Get Me Out of Here for ITV in the UK, Jack Taylor starring Ian Glenn of Game of Thrones fame for a ZDF in Germany, and IFTA nominated Drop Dead Weird for RTE2 Ireland and 7 Network Australia. Ronnie has edited numerous short films, including the multi-award-winning short film Ruby, as well as a number of short dramas for TG4's highly successful Steel series. Most recently, Ronnie edited the award-winning documentary Farewell to Music, a lyrical portrait of one of Ireland's most accomplished traditional musicians, Tony McMahon. Ronnie has also directed a number of short films, including the award-winning Connection Interrupted. Marty, it's a great privilege to have 2 very qualified men in their own field join us on the program today.
Yes, indeed, Michael. It's absolutely a pleasure to have our special guests, Leo and Ronnie Quinlan, and thank you for the introduction. And you're in Sydney, so we're about to cross
I'm
over
up
to Ireland.
in Sydney at the moment. It's raining up here in this part of the world. If you don't know Australia, we're in our winter period now, just going into winter, so it's a little bit overcast all day, but fortunately we're opening up after the pandemic, which is good. We've had a bad trot like most countries, but we're doing all right. We're getting there. And Marty, could I first of all thank you for your continued advocacy and for those with mental health issues, and in particular moral injury. I know you have your own story, which will be told, but giving a voice to others I just feel it's great that for people who can't speak out or they mightn't want to speak out for whatever reason. I think it's excellent that you're doing this program, and there'll be many programs on mental health, and there'll never be too many. But thank you for your contribution. It's
Well,
really
I
very
thank you,
well welcome.
Michael, and I thank Leo because he told me about his mental health, and I'm delighted to have Leo and Ronnie. And if I can start off with people, our listeners, and all over the world, before I start on the siege of Jarville, I want to ask Leo a question, which not a lot of people know in the bio, but you served at JFK's funeral as a cadet. Can you tell us a little bit? I know that wasn't rehearsed, so can you tell us a little bit about it? Because I find that quite fascinating.
Catching me a bit by surprise, Marty.
I do, that's what I do.
Yeah, I gather that. Anyway, no, I was 18 years of age. I was a senior cadet in the military college in the Curragh, your home place. And Kennedy had been in Ireland 6 or 8 weeks before he was assassinated. He saw our senior cadet class doing what they call the Queen Anne's drill that they do at gravesides when he was laying a wreath at the graves of the 1916 leaders in Arbor Hill. And he liked it so much that he asked the Irish government to make a film of this. This was pre-video days, and the government did this. Our senior class had been commissioned, so we were now seniors, and we were the ones that, let's say, rehearsed a bit, and then we were filmed, and our film was sent to him in the United States. He tried to, at least he wanted to, incorporate this drill into the American Army, but he was assassinated before he could do it. And after he was assassinated, within 24 hours, his wife asked the Irish government if we could go over and perform this funeral drill at his graveside.
How were you notified about that?
Like a lot of the cadets, it was a Saturday night. He was assassinated on Friday. We had a Saturday free day and free night, and we were dancing in Dublin and going to cinemas and places like that. When the call went out to return quickly to the Curragh camp, to the cadet school, lots of cadets were dancing, and security men and so on in the dance halls went looking for guys with crew cuts and said, "You must be a cadet." "Yes." "Well, you better get back to the Curragh quick." So we all went back to the Curragh, arriving about midnight. We were told we were going, first of all, they said we were going to Boston the next morning, and then it became Washington. And we went straight from our civilian clothes into uniform, rehearsing all through the night, and that 8 o'clock mass Sunday morning, and straight off to Dublin Airport, and joined up with Damon De Valera, who was on the flight, and off we went to the United States on that Sunday, and we returned on the Wednesday. We carried out the drill at the graveside on Monday the 25th of November.
What was it like being there?
It was very surreal, obviously. It was a hell of an adventure for 18-year-olds. We didn't know what to expect. We were sharing billets with the United States. I think they were called the 1st Battalion, and they specialized in Guards of Honor only. They did a 3-year stint carrying out Guards of Honor as required, particularly in the capital. So we were sharing billets with them. We found the food very strange. I mean, the first time I'd eaten iced cabbage, for example, and first time for lots of things. Then the other thing was that they did all their parades and their drills on grass. We did it on tarmac. So we would go to rehearsal about 9 o'clock in the morning, just to the last run through, and on the grass we were very bad. We were very poor because a lot of our movements, they're synchronized, sound synchronization. The slap of the butt of the rifle on the ground, and the foot on the ground, the heel hitting the ground. You know it yourself. And
the whole drill.
Yeah, the drill. So we were doing very badly, and we would begin to lose our confidence. So we were taken into the backyard of the building we were in. It was like a U shape and tarmac. And we started drilling again, and all of a sudden it came back to us. We were the way we needed to be. And I noticed then windows started opening everywhere. There were about 4 floors in this U-shaped building, and we were with this rubbish skips and everything in the back, and where the deliveries were made, and windows started opening, and next thing we were getting rounds of applause from the other soldiers and the cooks and everybody else and the workers in the area for the quality of our drill, and that gave us more confidence. Then we were taken to the graveside. We arrived there about 12 o'clock, if I remember correctly, and there was nobody there. just a few workers, nobody. And we were marched right up beside the grave. And right around the grave, there was grass carpet, so we're artificial grass carpet, making everything look nice. And we were waiting for JFK's funeral to arrive. It arrived nearly 4 hours later. We were standing there for 4 hours, not being able to see anything, and not knowing what was building up behind us. And there was a couple of 100,000 people maybe eventually building up behind us. And when we turned around after we did our drill and marched away, we found that all the other, what they call honor guards, we call them guards of honor, were behind us, the Marines, the Navy, the Air Force, and so on. So then we realized that we were actually in the real place of honor, right up beside the grave, right through the whole ceremony. Interesting.
It's a beautiful story. I believe, Michael, you have a little bit of a story.
Oh, well, listen, I'm aware of Leo's story, which is now forever in the history of JFK and his life and his death. And there's one observation I would make. JFK was very much an Irish, had great affinity with Ireland, and he wore his Irishness on his sleeve, as they say. And there's a bit of irony in the fact that even in death, the connection kind of was maintained by Leo and his cadets, the 37th class. They are at the graveside of JFK, one of the most popular presidents ever, to have an Irish salute, final salute there at the grave, I think is the stuff of history for sure. And it must have been a great occasion for Leo and his people.
And especially that Leo was so young, and that's what I like about it. And
well, now my story is nothing like Leo's going to tell you, but I was in the 5th platoon in the Army Apprentice School in Naas, and we were having our passing out parade, being the senior class. I think it was June, about 25th of June, around that period. And the day after, actually, we found ourselves up at Dublin Airport as JF Kennedy was arriving into the airport. And we were on the route there. We weren't in the official Guard of Honor. I think that came from the Eastern Command. But we were part of the official, I should say, entry for John F. Kennedy as he arrived at the airport. So that's my little story. Nothing, as I said, on Leo's.
No, but they're all, Michael, they're all wonderful stories. And I said, I cut Leo off hop there with that story because he's a very modest man. But let's go back to the moral injury. And this, I find, is personally and fascinating. I've learned a lot through Leo through it.
Yeah.
So, Leon, the first one we're going to go into for the listeners that don't know and all over the world, can you give us a little bit of a synopsis, especially that your father commanded on the siege of JADOTVILLE in the Congo in 1961, please?
Oh, well, putting it in the synopsis, as you said, I'm working on the assumption that a lot of people will know something about JADOTVILLE, i.e. they may have seen the movie, Siege of JADOTVILLE on Netflix. So working on that assumption, we'll take it from there. Basically, on the at the end of August 1961, there were two companies, a Swedish company and an Irish company, were in JADOTVILLE, supposedly to keep the peace. The white population was supposedly under threat from the black population, which when they went in, they discovered this was not true at all. They discovered it was a dangerous area, and the Swedish company commander, who was in charge of the two companies, the Irish and the Swedish company commander, he decided, or he was told by his bosses, to get out of there. So they returned quickly to Elizabethville, 18 miles away, which was the headquarters of the United Nations in Katanga, where most of the UN troops resided. As they were returning on the 2nd of September, the Belgian foreign minister, Jean-Henri Spaak, he requested troops to be sent back out to JADOTVILLE for the same mission to protect the white population. He made that request to Dag Hammarskjöld, the Secretary General of the United Nations in New York, who sent a message to the force commander in the Congo, who was based 1,000 miles away in Leopoldville, send more troops back to JADOTVILLE. The brigade commander in Katanga, in Elizabethville, who was in charge of all the UN troops in the province of Katanga, he advised not to send any more troops out to JADOTVILLE. And in fact, the Indian battalion and the Swedish battalion refused to send anybody back out to JADOTVILLE. However, A company, my father's company, were ordered to go to JADOTVILLE. So on the 3rd of September, they moved out there, 80 miles away. They went with very limited weaponry. They didn't have enough ammunition except for a few days. They only had rations for 3 days because of lack of transport. There was lack of very bad situation transport-wise. So they went out in 2 or 3 shifts, we'll call it that, out to JADOTVILLE over a period of a few days. They left all their heavy weapons behind them, i.e. the heavy mortars and the ammunition. They left a lot of what they needed behind them and could never get resupplied when needed. So there you had a situation of 155 men out in JADOTVILLE, undersupplied with weapons and ammunition and food. They found, as the previous 2 companies had found, that there was no threat to the white population in JADOTVILLE. It turned out later, it became known later that they were like pawns in a political chess game. However, a company took over what would not be termed the best defensive position, i.e. they took over villas and buildings and so on that were rented by the United Nations for any UN troops that might have occasion to visit JADOTVILLE or be based in JADOTVILLE.
Yeah.
Very, very quickly, they realized the situation was not very nice because they saw getting the troops, gendarmerie as they were called, building up forces around them. At one stage, they counted 1,200 enemy around them. They became enemy later. Remember, there was no fighting anywhere at this stage. They were keeping the peace.
Yeah.
Anyway, things were happening, getting a bit tense. So my father ordered everybody to dig in, and they started digging trenches and what became a kind of an oval-shaped perimeter defense. For the first day and the second day, he tightened the defense, made it smaller so that everybody could coordinate their movements together and virtually shout to each other across 150 yards of trenches. It was 150 in one direction, 120 in another direction. If you can imagine an oval-shaped defensive position.
Yes.
Back in Elizabethville, meantime, the morning of the 13th of September 1961, the United Nations in Elizabethville attacked the Katanga positions, i.e. the radio station, the newspaper office, and the post office. The idea was to take over the voice of President Chombe of Katanga, and if they could, to arrest Chombe as well. However, they forgot, I use the word forgot, inverted commas, to tell the people in JADOTVILLE that this attack was going in 80 miles away. And this is, I suppose, the kernel of the whole, if you want to call it, situation, story, scandal, whatever way you like to put it. But anyway, out in JADOTVILLE, 80 miles away, 155 men were totally unaware of an attack that their brigade was putting in and their battalion was putting in 80 miles away in Elizabethville. The one in Elizabethville is called Operation Mortar. It happened at 4 o'clock in the morning. At 25 minutes past 7 that morning, the ordinary officer in JADOTVILLE, namely Lieutenant Noel Carey, who's still alive, now a retired captain, 85 years of age approximately, living in Castlebar, he got a phone call from Elizabethville to say Operation Mortar successful. First they ever heard of Operation Mortar. Immediately he informed my father. My father said, sound the alarm. The alarm was sounded, but before it could actually be sounded properly, they were attacked. It's all shown on the film, but 7:35 in the morning, gendarmerie in heavily armored with heavy machine guns and jeeps came up the main road, which went right to the position, the Irish position. They attacked, and there were a company of enemy creeping through the grass at the same time to attack them from a different direction. The Irish learned later that the gendarmerie expected the battle to be over in an hour. They were going to come through with machine guns, do as much damage as they could, and the troops coming in through the grass then would mop up. It didn't happen that way because Private Dell saw what was happening. He fired a Gustav. Gustav, now you wouldn't hit anything at 20 yards with the Gustav, but the fact that he fired it alerted Sergeant John Mullen from Athlone, who jumped behind Vickers' machine gun and knocked out the first jeep as it was coming through. The other two couldn't come. Immediately, everybody who was at Mass that morning, actually, they went to Mass every morning, they just got into positions and the battle started. It went on for 4 or 5 days, and it ended on the Sunday when they ran out of food, water, ammunition. And one of the most important things was that the 2 armored cars that they had, and Marty, your dad was in one of them, they were let's say, the backbone to some degree of the reserve, because they were very mobile and they could go in and out among the positions and the buildings and so on and so forth, wherever they were needed. They had heavy machine guns, which were running short of ammunition, but worse than that, they were firing so much during the 4 days, 5 days of fighting that the locks on the machine guns seized up and machine guns could no longer be used. As one veteran told me, all the enemy had to do was wait another 24 hours and would come in and found everybody comatose in the trenches from fatigue and disease that was setting in, etc. I can go into great detail at any time about all the conditions, but this is really it in a synopsis. They ended up having no choice on the Sunday but to accept the terms of the Minister of the Interior of Katanga, Minister Monongo, that's like the Justice Minister, who came to negotiate with my father a ceasefire, which they subsequently broke, because the terms of the agreement was that they could come out of the trenches, bring their weapons with them, go into a hotel in JADOTVILLE, and let's wait for the politicians to solve the problem. But once they were out of the trenches, and when no more help was coming from the UN 80 miles away in Elizabethville, who had tried twice to get through but couldn't, and didn't deliver the airstrikes that they promised, when it became known that the Irish in JADOTVILLE had no further help coming, all of a sudden they became prisoners of war. They became prisoners of war for 6 weeks, and then they were exchanged for Katanga prisoners or gendarmerie prisoners, and they were rearmed, back in action again, and the 2 or 3 other major, almost as serious as JADOTVILLE conflicts in November, December, before they were repatriated home. Now, that's a very, very quick synopsis, Marty.
Yes, no, that's Michael, can I bring you in?
Yeah, Leo, could I just, going back to JADOTVILLE and reading about, there's so many questions that we could ask, and we wouldn't have time to answer them today, but you mentioned the perimeter of defense, which your dad implied,
yes,
which has been cited in many military books and has been a brilliant strategic thing to do. Was he ever acknowledged in the earlier years for his leadership in that area and protecting his men?
Well, good question, Michael. Before he went home, the Brigadier General Raja from the Indian Army, who was the brigade commander in Katanga, I have a document that he wrote. The Army, it's in Army records, that wrote that he complimented my father on his defensive action, on the way he performed his duty, that he showed my father. When he came back to Ireland, when the A Company came back to Ireland, there were civic receptions everywhere. I remember in Athlone, for example, at the railway station, half the town turned out when my father came home in the last flight home, the last number of men, because he waited until the last guy, because one of the men, Jimmy Redmond, had been wounded and he wanted to come home with him, and he was from Athlone. So the town turned out civic reception. They were wined and dined and feted the newspapers, praising them, etc., etc. So yes, in the early stages, they were complimented and praised, etc., etc. But then about 6 months to 9 months later, the whole thing just died a death.
Why would you think that?
Why?
Did it change?
It's look, for years and years it was swept under the carpet, and I suppose the best way to describe it is as was written by about 2 years ago by the director of operations of the U.S. Army War College, who runs a peace operations course on UN type operations. It was said in the article written that the fiasco that was the Congo in 1961, if publicity had been given to A Company, it would have tarnished the reputation of the United Nations and the Irish Army. Consequently, the Irish authorities swept this brilliant defensive action under the carpet for decades. And that's really it in a nutshell.
Well, that's exciting, and I want to go into the moral injury. And Michael, I know you've got questions, but I want to bring Ronnie in here. I know you're sitting there, Ronnie. You're sitting, listening to us, and you're listening to your dad probably all your life. So you know, how are you going, Ronnie? We'll bring you in there.
Good, yeah. No, I've heard my dad give the talk on JADOTVILLE numerous times, so I'm almost an expert myself at this stage.
I was going to say, and the thing is with you, Ronnie, is you're making a documentary, which I'm fascinated.
Yeah.
And can before we go into the moral injury back to your father, can I ask you a couple of questions? That what made you want to do a documentary on the aftermath?
Well, I suppose, Marty, there's two main reasons, and the first is that once I studied film and TV in college, and that's what I do for a living. I'm an editor, and I wanted to kind of use my skills to maybe bring the story to life because I knew so much about it and intimate family knowledge of it. And though the story had been told quite a few times, let's say with the Netflix Siege of JadotVille movie, and there's a documentary that was made for TV here in Ireland called Congo: An Irish Affair, which went very deep into the political situation at the time and the battle, and it was very well made. But neither of them examine the aftermath, which for me is probably the most interesting, because I suppose the second reason, joining on to the first for making it, is that my grandfather, growing up, was an important figure to me, as all grandfathers are. But it was only after his death that I started to hear stories of Jadottville, and certainly at his funeral, because it was the 21-gun salute. It was an army funeral with all the bells and whistles, and the top brass were all there. And I suddenly realized, okay, he must have been quite important in life. Whereas when I was a kid growing up, he was my granddad, and there was no, I didn't think anything deeper than that.
Did your granddad ever speak, Ronnie? Did he ever speak about JADOTVILLE? Did he ever speak?
No, never. Well, never to me, certainly, and I don't think he really spoke. He probably spoke to my dad a bit about it because he had been in the army, but no, he never really did. And I think that's one of the saddest things for me, is that he was never, because he had two sons that went to the army whilst he was still serving post Jadottville. He probably didn't have, he probably didn't want to speak out about it, about how he might have been treated and how his company were treated. And I think he probably thought, let sleeping dogs lie, and let's not rock the boat. So I think part of it for me is to try and tell his story, because he couldn't tell it in his own life,
Well, I can
Ronnie,
all I
can
can
I ask
say
a question?
Yeah, go ahead, Michael, please.
I was just going to thinking about you, Ronnie, and I've probably got two questions. Did you ever think about joining the forces yourself, the Irish Army?
Good.
And whilst doing the documentary, did it change you in any way, or did you see things differently?
Well, first, joining the army, yes, I was in the FCA actually, for a short while. I didn't like being, told what to do. So
it's like the same as you, Ronnie. There's two of us. You're not alone, Ronnie.
Yeah, so so very quickly I realized maybe this is not for me. But the main reason I went in, this is an aside, but it might be a bit interesting for moral injury as well. I joined mainly because they were making the Steven Spielberg movie Saving Private Ryan in Ireland, and they were using the FCA troops to play the American soldiers on the D-Day landing on the beaches of Normandy. So they used Wexford, Curracloe Beach down in County Wexford as the setting for the beach landing. So I joined the FCA with the view to try and get in on the movie, and thankfully I did. So I spent a month down filming the battle scenes for the first half an hour of Saving Private Ryan. It was a mock war, but it was a very visceral experience, and without the fear. So in terms of being in battle, it felt like I was in battle, but yet there was no fear of death.
You understood what your grandfather and obviously your dad in war. Now, guys, can we take a quick break here, and we'll come back in a second. We're just going to play a little thing for Moral Injury by Tracy Connolly, and we'll come back.
Hello everyone, and welcome to Tracy Connolly's Poetries. Most of you would know that I am an Irish veteran, and I've served my country for 23 years. I find it very befitting to wear my Irish veteran uniform for my next poem. I dedicate this poem to Colonel Pat Quinlan and his JADOTVILLE men who served in the Congo in 1961 in the siege of JADOTVILLE. I called my poem Moral Injury. Who are we to judge our own, who travelled abroad to the horrors unknown? Who are we to look down on them when they served their country as great men? Who are we to forget their pain when they battled together on the Congo's plain? Who are we to say no to them when they've earned their medal or even 10? Who are we when we see men fade to a shadow of themselves in this charade? Who are we when we let them down, when they called for help on Ireland's ground? Who are we when they were left behind for their forgotten braveries to save mankind? Who are we to hush their voice as they try to speak and avoid the noise? Who are we to ignore their sufferings after much blood shed and years of troubling? Who are we to see a unit thrown on JADOTVILLE soil with an outcome unknown? Who are we to ignore their honour, like dismissing results from great scholars? Who are we to avoid what's true, but finally give justice to their rescue? Who are we that causes moral injury for it to go down in wrongful history? Who are we to neglect the signs of loneliness, suicides, mental disorders and unhappiness? Who are we as an Irish Free State, known for our sacrifices were never too late? Who are we to not praise Ireland's sons as they battled together for justice being done? Thank you.
Well, Ronnie, that's exciting, your stuff. And Michael, we'll come back to Ronnie in a minute, but can you ask Leo a question there now?
Well, Marty, if we could probably finish off on JADOTVILLE, which would probably dovetail into post-traumatic stress and moral injury, which Leo's going to talk to us about. Leo, can you briefly talk about the information or misinformation that came at the end of the ceasefire back to Ireland, which caused huge trauma amongst the families, the immediate families of the people who were captured? Because I believe that kind of started the whole thing of trauma and post-traumatic stress and moral injury. Tell us about that information factor, which seemed to be nowhere.
Yeah. Okay, I understand. It wasn't so much that it happened after the Battle of JADOTVILLE. It happened during the Battle of JADOTVILLE.
All right. Yeah.
For example, in those days, nobody had telephones, really. My mother had a telephone. She was getting information from the colonel in the barracks every few hours, the latest information that they got. But the information that the Irish authorities were getting was coming via the BBC to a large extent. And the BBC, the UK had an axe to grind in all of this thing because they were one of the investors in Katanga on the anti-UN side. They were the ones that were investing in the mines and all the, let's say, the wealth of Katanga. So they were getting a lot of misinformation back in Ireland, and some of it was just pure stupidity. Some of it was actually disinformation, deliberately. But either way, the result was that on Friday of that week, remember the battle started 16th Wednesday, Thursday, Friday. On the Friday, it was in the Evening Herald that the company had been massacred and that 20 officers had been put up against a wall and shot by a firing squad. That was a bad day, believe me, in Athlone. As well as that, there was a blackout in Athlone, a power failure. So it became known as Black Friday forever and ever in Athlone. I remember getting phone calls from the barracks, my mother getting phone from the barracks saying, look, this is the only information we have, sorry, and so on. And then the next morning, Saturday, the wives of the officers came to our house. They came from Galway, Longford, Mullingar, places like that. And then we were trying to figure out how could we have funeral services without bodies. It was at that stage, phoning the churches and getting some ideas and so on and so forth. So Saturday was a very bad day as a result of all the misinformation or disinformation or lack of information. Then Sunday morning came and the word came that they were all alive, which was fantastic, of course. So I had been going on my bicycle to the various housing estates in Athlone, giving them the information every time my mother got a phone call, as in every evening after school. So on the Sunday morning, when the good news came, I cycled madly down to the housing estates, particularly Assumption Road, where 13 men from JADOTVILLE lived in this one street. And, and when I arrived in Assumption Road in Athlone, my God, they were swarming out. They must have had, scouts out. Oh, he's coming, he's coming. They all came running out onto the street, and I arrived in the middle of them on my bicycle. And just then a staff car from the barracks came, but I remember his name, Commandant Owen Curtin, soccer player, later left the army to go to Belvedere College. And his tears running down his face, and they thought the worst. And he said, no, let me, give me a minute. And he kind of paused himself, and then he said, okay, they're all alive. He said, they're all alive, don't worry. Well, there was jumping for joy, people nearly fainting with joy and crying with joy. And, it was a wonderful time.
Yeah.
So that is the only, Michael, misinformation, disinformation that I'm aware of, what had happened during the time of JADOTVILLE.
And so, Leo, we talk about post-traumatic stress, which is 3 or 4 decades old now, but moral injury seems to have surfaced with the JADOTVILLE story. Would you like to just explain to us or elaborate a little bit on moral injury?
Okay, well, I won't say moral injury just to surface with it surfaced with us because of JADOTVILLE, but it had been around for a few other years, let's say highlighted in a couple of writings in America. Wally Jensen, bronze medal winner at the age of 19 in Vietnam, became a chaplain in the American forces, wrote a book called Moral Injury, Moral Wounds. A man called Jonathan Shaw also wrote about moral injury. And I became aware of moral injury in January of 2021, January of last year, because I have certain working relationship with the U.S. Army War College about JADOTVILLE. And then I was invited to join this group, War, Peace and Justice Group, who are examining the whole issue of moral injury. And they raised it with me. And they said, by the way, we think that JADOTVILLE is the perfect example of collective moral injury. Also, they say that JADOTVILLE is, and the descendants of JADOTVILLE is a perfect example of transgenerational moral injury, where it goes down through the generations where children and grandchildren can suffer moral injury. So the obvious question is, what is moral injury? It's defined
How does it manifest
in 2 ways. Correct. It's defined in 2 ways that I can, let's say, have empathy with, and that I can relate to, and the JADOTVILLE veterans I've spoken to and their children also relate to. And Marty, I think you and I have had discussions on this, and you can relate to this. Moral injury is defined as where soldiers suffer some extraordinary traumatic experience and are then betrayed by higher authority. Now that is JADOTVILLE.
Yeah, but Michael,
well, it's not just. I'm listening to officers from America, from England, from Germany, and they say that's the same in our countries. It's the same after Vietnam, same after the Gulf War, same after Iran, Iraq, same after Afghanistan. So it's not just the Irish that suffer. Every country apparently suffers from moral injury.
And Leo, if I can just jump in there in a second while you're saying that, is on moral injury. You're saying army, but I presume that's not just within the army. That runs in certain and in a lot of walks of life.
I'm quite sure it does. Sure it does. But it's the trauma factor that soldiers undergo or experience, like JADOTVILLE and other battles. Yes. Probably more so moral injury is affected there. But I don't know. But the other the definition of moral injury, which I think is very interesting, particularly from an Irish perspective, is where soldiers are required to perform actions that would go against their moral or religious upbringing or ethos or their family ethos, i.e., in the case of JADOTVILLE, killing people when they were sent out there to keep the peace. Now,
Well,
I know.
wouldn't that, Leo, also affect moral injury? Wouldn't that be in like police forces, fire brigade?
I'm absolutely sure it would be. The things they see.
I also believe learning through you with moral injury I think if a parent lets you down, that's moral injury, because the parent, you look after them and you're looking up to them. So that's moral injury in itself.
Yeah, well, it makes sense. Now, same thing in hospitals, what doctors, young doctors, young nurses see in hospitals. I'm sure now, and then maybe they're disregarded by their powers that be. You know, we can take it to in every walk of life, but the army and JADOTVILLE and so on is probably the example that we know most about. But the other thing about moral injury is, when I said that they do things that they would not normally like to do, and their upbringing wouldn't gear them for it. The one thing my father regretted about JADOTVILLE was too many killed during JADOTVILLE. He said it to me. He said it to my brother. He told me how it happened. Ronnie was saying earlier about my father didn't talk to Ronnie about it. He didn't talk to me about JADOTVILLE until I had proven myself in the army. But I think I was a commandant nearly and a ranger before he started kind of telling me about things in JADOTVILLE. And the results on the person of JADOTVILLE, or the effects, of moral injury, the effects of moral injury on the individual are defined as they become silent. And that is JADOTVILLE. Now, it's also First World War, Second World War, Korean War. They go silent. They don't talk about it until maybe something triggers it, like it could be a family bereavement. It could be they're coming near the end of their day.
Leo, like you said,
when the film came out.
You said to me, though, it has relationship problems, difficulties, alcohol abuse.
Yeah, well, that's silence is the first thing. Yeah. Then you have relationship problems, broken marriages, can't hold down a job after leaving the army.
So, Leo, let me ask you, what effects do you pick out of all of those, as that we read there? Silence, relationship problems, difficulty holding a job, alcohol abuse, mental health issues, depression, suicide. Obviously, you know mine with my mom, that side of it.
Yes.
How did that affect, what do you think your dad went through? Because it would have been horrendous that he had to bring, and I always say this, is he didn't just bring the 165 men home. The pressure would have been horrendous. And at the stage, including myself, there's nearly 10,000 offsprings. If he'd have gone through and they were all... So how did it affect you personally? That's what I'm asking. And your dad.
Well, okay, take my dad. My wife and I sometimes argued a little bit about, dad suffered from post-traumatic stress. I don't think he did, because I thought he was a very strong individual. But then when I heard about moral injury, the penny dropped and said, he suffered from that. Obviously, he suffered from that. Then I spoke to the children, as I said, of others, and another officer's son, who's also a retired army officer like me. He said, that was my dad, moral injury, absolutely, absolutely. And when I spoke to veterans themselves and said, yeah, that's me, moral injury, I never spoke about it.
Well,
okay, but then how does it affect the family?
You understand it. I understand the moral injury, but that's what I'm asking you, how it affected you.
Yeah, well, funny, it didn't affect me growing up so much because Dad didn't talk about it. It didn't affect me until almost when I left the army. And then I started going through my father's papers after he passed away. And I started learning an awful lot more. And then when I started hunting the JADOTVILLE story for the film and so on, being asked by the director, could I give him information? I started going through my father's papers. Then I started realizing a lot of things. Then I suppose it started affecting me, but it affected me in different ways. First of all, I've got total admiration for my dad and all the men of JADOTVILLE, what they went through during the battle and what they put up with afterwards.
Yeah.
I have anger in me against the powers that be that allowed this thing to happen. A lot of disappointment in the army authorities, because I was a pure soldier myself, and I'm a bit disappointed that they've let their people down.
Would you agree with me, Leo, that although you've educated me in it, do you think you would suffer from moral injury?
Well, I've just said that well, maybe if I was in the same situation, I would. I mean, I say some of the guys in JADOTVILLE didn't suffer from moral injury, I would think, or even post-traumatic stress. And I say this because I know of one who lapped it up, who loved it, who became, the bloodlust came up. One man, he left.
Leo, if I could say, I think
but that's a different thing.
But that's a very valid point, Leo, because it's not a one-size-fits-all. In a situation and listening to you, like the one thing, as you know, was as soldiers, trust is paramount to what we do.
Yeah.
You got to trust your mates and your leadership. But moral injury occurs when you're sent out into battle or into conflict because it's against what your values are, what your ethics are, and to kill someone normal.
That's true.
But so then that can have an effect on people under moral injury. But when I look at the JADOTVILLE and maybe other situations where this betrayal came into it, that's where that's compounded the whole thing.
I would agree completely. I would agree completely. I would say, and I've said it in writing to the Chief of Staff, to the Department of Defense, and to the Minister of Defense, if, for example, they weren't betrayed, I didn't say that word, but if, for example, Matt Quinlan, and I use his name, supposing Matt Quinlan had received his recognition that was recommended, i.e. promotion and a medal that was recommended for the brave things he did at the age of 16, what might this have meant to him? He could have mentally handled what he had gone through 100%. And handled, and if whereas he was made feel that he had done something wrong or he was cast aside like the rest, etc. And that's, I think, where moral injury kicked in big time. Now, I'm a layman in all of this. I emphasize I'm a layman, so I'm surmising things. But to me, it makes sense. If these fellows had been looked after, if they had been counseled when they came home, and that's happening now, by the way, with the Irish Army. They're constantly.
And please bring that in too, Leo. It's not just the counselling of, as you know, what you've read my stuff on. It's not the counsel of the men, it's the women and the partners, the wives, the boyfriends, the girlfriends, whatever it's in. They lived through that as well. And that's a big thing. They were let down as well. They sent the time.
Well, I have been told by certain children of JADOTVILLE, we'll call them children of JADOTVILLE, like you're a child, you're a JADOTVILLe baby, Marty. You were born after that. I never even knew. So I've been told by children of JADOTVILLE that they have aggro among them. And these are adults now who are in the 60s and 70s, and all through their lives, they have had aggro among them because of JADOTVILLE. So moral injury has gone down to that generation. Hopefully, it's not gone.
It's a ripple effect.
It's a ripple effect
down along the line. Now, I want to bring in Ronnie here, Ronnie, and I want to ask Ronnie, how did you see your grandfather? And the same questions, is your dad the one that's doing all the talking there? Your dad as well. What did you see the change in them?
Well, it's difficult to really speak about my grandfather in that way because of the age gap and not knowing about JADOTVILLE. But I know towards the end of his life there was a bitterness. I think he was very much about his troops. He loved the men that were under him.
Oh God, yeah.
And I think he was deeply hurt by the fact that they weren't recognized and they weren't looked after, and a lot of them suffered after coming home with, as we've been talking about moral injury, with no supports for them or their families. And I think that he probably took that bitterness to his grave. I heard a really good quote from a writer, an English writer called G.K. Chesterton, and he said that a true leader fights not because he hates what's in front of him, but because he loves what's behind him.
Oh.
And I think that probably sums up my grandfather. I think that sums up him. He really loved his troops. Lovely. And I think the bitterness and anger, which he never spoke about, was just inside him for years and years. And
How did you know? How did you know, Ronnie, that he had bitterness and anger inside him? What did you swap? How did you notice that?
He was gruff. He was a gruff man. He was, especially as a young boy, he was an imposing figure who, I suppose, the last few years of his life, he also had a voice box because he had throat cancer. So he wasn't able to communicate as well as he would have for that. And I think a lot of frustrations, you could just see he was angry. He was an angry man.
I know.
Probably drank too much towards the end of his life as well. And I'm sure all of that was part of the pain he had suffered for, the internal pain for years.
Ronnie, could I ask a question? You're interviewing many people for your documentary, and you're listening to all this some horrific stories. I would suggest to you, and they say if you listen to a story without judging, well, and you can bear it, that can be very empowering for the person telling the story, because they know at least, this man can bear what I'm telling him, and they can often look at the story differently. But when they're telling you the story, how do you feel? Do you get involved in it yourself, or do you have to struggle not to get involved?
Well, I've spoken to Matt Quinlan's two sisters, and their story was very powerful, and it definitely affected me. I could feel the emotion. It was kind of hard to interview them at times. There's a sadness, and I suppose because my grandfather was the commanding officer, and there's that sadness is in me as well.
Of course.
And it is hard to listen to, and it's but I want to get the story out there, and I want to, I suppose, in some way it'll maybe go to heal a bit of the wounds that are there. Moral injury itself, like I've been reading a book about moral injury written by a woman called Nancy Sherman. She's a professor in Georgetown University in Washington. It's a present area of study, moral injury, because they're gaining more and more knowledge of it all the time from all the wars, especially the American wars, because they've been involved in so many of them. But it's that sense of grievance that you've gone to war and you've done your best, and yet you're treated shamefully afterwards. That very much is JADOTVILLE.
Yeah.
I think, like my dad talked about the medals and Matt Quinlan, and I certainly think that if the medal had been given to him, that it would have been confirmation that he did something heroic, that he did his job well, rather than feeling ashamed that he was involved in JADOTVILLE in the first place, which would have been across the board. I'm sure a lot of the veterans felt that shame, when it was swept under the rug, and this was their leadership who made them feel this way. And even now, look at Afghanistan. You had so many soldiers over there who suffered horrific moral injury, seeing friends of theirs die beside them on the battlefield, and suffer, going for a battle that would lasted 20 years, and only for the US government to pull them out of the country in 2 days.
Yeah.
And then feeling like, what was it for? Why did we do it?
Well, Ronnie, can I just interrupt for a second and just say to your grandfather, what he did was, he didn't save 165 men by doing the right things and digging trenches. He saved so many people, including siblings, and if in his end of these days, he wanted to have a drink or have a smoke, well, that was his choice. And that's moral injury, isn't it?
Absolutely. I suppose everyone has their own coping mechanism, don't they?
Yes, that's exactly right.
And like I said earlier at the start, for me, making this documentary is, as it's progressing, it's becoming much more about moral injury and about the voices of the soldiers who were there and their families who had to suffer from the moral injury that was put upon them from the battle and from the aftermath. There was one story, actually, my grandfather, when he was on his deathbed, and that was something that stuck in my head, and it's still there. It's still quite poignant, and he was dying anyway. It was maybe a day or two before he died, and two soldiers who served under him in JADOTVILLE came in their uniforms and their berets, and they marched in to the bedroom in the hospital and didn't speak to anybody. Just stood at the end of the bed and gave their name and rank and saluted to him and then they turned and walked out.
Wow. And that,
And that stuck with me, and that was certainly something that
a
I
beautiful,
kept.
sad but beautiful moment.
Yeah, it was a beautiful moment. Yeah, and it just showed the respect they had, and I think the respect went both ways. And I suppose with moral injury, people, from what I've been reading, soldiers who have suffered it if they're with people that they can trust, and they feel like they can talk about this, they will open up, which is probably the best thing that they can do. And soldiers, the JADOTVILLE men would have had, I'm sure, an unbelievable bond that was forged in the battle, and maybe between themselves they could speak a little bit more about it, but it's very hard for them to open up, I suppose, to the rest.
That's very true, Ronnie. But even through all the trauma and the injury, their lives still have meaning. Like they still have, there's something driving them, and I think if we do listen, as you say, without judging them and just let them tell the story, I believe we can, in a way, journey with them and help them to somewhere get to a point where things aren't as bad as they were, if you know what I mean. Because they have to get out of bed in the morning and maybe go to work or look after their kids, or the kids have got to go to school. Life still goes on. So I suppose we're in a situation now. How do we manage that outside? JADOTVILLE it's over, and it's highlighted an enormous deficiency in our support mechanisms all over the world. But I suppose now we've got to see how can we best look after these people and their families, which, as Marty said, there's a ripple effect goes down through, because this can come up it surfaced many years after the event. We never know. So
yeah, exactly. You're right, Michael.
So support of the people left here now, I think, and I think I'd like to acknowledge ONE and UNVA in Ireland. From my reading, they do quite a bit of stuff in the area of support.
I've got to say too, Michael, is through my life and mine's, I never knew about JADOTVILLE, didn't know for a few years ago, but what I've learned through Leo and talking about moral injury, and we speak a lot on certain things, I've learned more, and I'd use the word understanding of my parents by learning what moral injury is. That's, and I thank Leo for that. He's my...
Welcome.
Go ahead, Leo.
No, I was just saying you're very welcome, Marty. Because I think we're all...
No, but that's what it is, and you know that when we talk about it, and as Michael's saying there, and Ronnie, you're very open about everything. It's a pleasure just that we're talking openly about this, and I hope our listeners, they realize, as Michael said there, if you've got any things, we're not qualified in anything, but just understand things. Talking about things and understanding things, I think, are so important, and especially with men. And Ronnie, I've got to say, talking to you, you're an absolute gentleman, the way and you've got a lovely approach, understanding your grandfather and your dad, which, if you can get a word in edgeways, you know what I mean? Yeah, but I do honestly say it's a very honest, and Michael, you're the same. So now, who's got any more questions?
I'd just like to say that at the moment we have got a Royal Commission going on in Australia. It opened last week.
Oh,
actually,
that's right. Yes.
On veterans and suicide, and there's over 1,200 suicided here in the last 2 decades in Australia. There's twice as many suicided from the war in Afghanistan than did die in Australia when they came back.
Wow.
From the war in Afghanistan. So it's powerful, but you know, I've been reading a bit about it, and I haven't yet seen the word moral injury anywhere. Now, I haven't done a lot of reading, but any reports I've been looking at, that particular phrase or 2 words, moral injury, hasn't been mentioned. So I'm just wondering
it makes sense, doesn't it? It makes sense, the moral injury, and as I said, the understanding of it. Now, guys, we're up with time on this show, and we'll come back on the later show, and we've got some guests next week. So listen, Leo, Ronnie, Michael, my co-host, thank you so much, and thank you for the show, and I'll talk to you later.
Thank you, Marty. And Leo and Ronnie Quinlan will join us again on our next episode on moral injury. Plus, we'll have other special guests. Now, as mentioned on the programme, Ronnie is making a documentary on the fallout from the Battle of JADOTVILLE. And if you would like in any way to contribute, please email ronnie.quinlan@gmail.com. That's ronnie.quinlan@gmail.com. Thank you again for joining us, and if you do have any comments or inquiries about our program today, you can go to Stop Calling Me Mental with Marty and Michael. Stop Calling Me Mental. We'll conclude this program with a tribute to an Irish hero from the Battle of JADOTVILLE. His name is Matt Quinlan. Hi. My name is Michael Lyons. I'm a member of the United Irish Ex-Services Association Australia and the Australian Peacekeeping and Peacemakers Association. I served with the 42nd Irish Battalion in Cyprus in 1965. I'd like to tell you a brief story about a fellow Irish UN peacekeeping veteran. His name is Matt Quinlan. Matt joined the Irish Army following in his father Ned's footsteps, who was a quartermaster sergeant and served in the Congo in 1963. Matt was deployed to the Congo in June of 1961 with the 35th Infantry Battalion. He was only 16 years of age. The now well-documented siege of JADOTVILLE took place in September of 1961. Matt Quinlan and A Company came under fire from the Katanga troops, who were loyal to the state of Katanga. Fierce fighting broke out and continued for some 5 days. Out of ammunition, water and supplies, a ceasefire was requested. Matt spent his 17th birthday being held with 154 other Irish soldiers in a prisoner of war camp following the ceasefire. Successful negotiations took place, the prisoners were released, and Matt and his mates were home for Christmas. At first, a hero's welcome was given to the JADOTVILLE heroes, but that wasn't to last. The mood changed when the UN higher authorities refused to support the ceasefire, and in effect it became a surrender. Their bravery and resilience against all odds was disregarded, and the JADOTVILLE heroes became the subject of ridicule by those who did not know the truth about the siege. These injustices were devastating. Some of the heroes suicided, ended up in mental institution, and broke their families up. In 1964, let down and disillusioned, 20-year-old Matt Quinlan left the army and after a short stay in London, hit for the outback of Australia. He settled in the Queensland town of Winton. He became part of the community and felt very comfortable with the Indigenous people of the area. Matt was their Irish hero, especially after he reportedly saved a young lad from drowning in the local river. His letters home to his mother were stories of life in his adopted country, where he seemed to have settled and was contented. His mother's many requests for Matt to make a visit back to the homeland never eventuated. In June 1992, at the age of 47, Matt Quinlan, in the dry, burnt outback of Queensland, Australia, took his own life, far, far away from the green hills of Ireland. 3 of Matt's siblings travelled to Winton and with the local community laid Matt to rest. The locals, not knowing that he was an Irish war hero, recommended for a Distinguished Services Medal. He served his country with courage and with pride. To Matt's family far across the world, can I say that our thoughts and prayers are very much with you, your parents and your siblings who have now passed. Stay strong and remember Matt's service and courage will not be forgotten while we have these precious memories, lest we forget.